Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're going to tackle a huge question in statistics. How do you get big, confident answers when you only have a tiny little bit of data? It's all about making smart conclusions even when you don't have the whole picture. So let's just dive right in with a problem that, let's be honest, every single data analyst or researcher runs into. You've only got a small sample to work with. So how in the world can you be sure about your findings? Is having a small sample a really big problem? Well, to figure out the solution for small data, we actually have to start with the opposite. We need to look at the tool we use when we're lucky enough to have tons of data, the old reliable workhorse of statistics. You know, in statistics, there's this kind of magic number you always hear about, 30. It's a rule of thumb, really. Once your sample size gets over 30, you can generally trust that it's big enough to act in a predictable way. And for these big, healthy data sets, the z-distribution is your go-to. And this is that perfect, beautiful, symmetrical bell curve you always see in textbooks. It's called the standard normal distribution, and it's a huge deal in stats because, well, it represents this ideal world where our data is so good, so plentiful, that it gives us a perfect reflection of reality. Okay, but what happens when we don't have that luxury? What if our sample size is way below that magic number of 30? What do we do when those perfect, ideal conditions just aren't there? This is where things get tricky. This gives us a double whammy of a problem. First, yeah, the sample is small, which means there's just more uncertainty baked in. But second, and this is a big one, we have no way of knowing the true standard deviation of the entire population. I mean, think about it, the whole population. We only know the standard deviation for the few people in our tiny sample. The real value is a total mystery. And this is where our hero of the day comes into play. It's a totally different tool, one that was specifically designed for these messy, common, real-world situations where data is scarce and you just have to work with what you've got. And here's the really clever part, the workaround. We have to make a substitution. Since we can't possibly know the standard deviation for the whole population, we do the next best thing. We just calculate it from our small sample and use that as our best, most educated guess. Now let's look at how this plays out in the math. And don't worry, it's not as scary as it looks. The formulas look almost identical, right? But check out that crucial change. On the left, the z-test uses that Greek letter sigma. That's the mystery population value. On the right, the t-test just swaps it for the letter s, our calculated sample value. A simple but powerful trade. And because we made that swap, we also have to use a new critical value, t, instead of z. Okay, but to use this new t-distribution, there's one more piece to the puzzle we need. It's a brand new concept that actually controls the exact shape of our curve. It's called degrees of freedom. Now I know, that sounds super complicated, but the calculation couldn't be easier. It's just your sample size minus 1. That's it. Think of it like this. It's basically asking, hey, how many of my data points are truly free to be whatever they want? Once you know the average, that last data point is kind of locked in. This one little number is the key to the entire t-distribution. So we have this new thing, degrees of freedom. What does that actually do? How does it connect our new t-distribution back to that big, perfect z-distribution we started with? Well, it turns out they are super closely related. Think of it like watching something transform. When you have hardly any data, let's say degrees of freedom is just 1, the curve is kind of short and wide. It has these fat tails. And those wide tails are super important. They're the distribution's way of saying, hey, we're not very certain here. But then, as you add more data, your degrees of freedom go up, and you can see the tails start to get thinner, pulling in towards the middle. The curve gets more confident. So it's a really simple relationship, right? The two are locked together. As you increase your sample size, you automatically increase your degrees of freedom. More data literally gives you more statistical freedom to work with. So what's the end game? What happens when you get a ton of data? Well, eventually, once you get past that magic number of 30 samples, the t-distribution is transformed so much that it basically just becomes the z-distribution. They merge and become pretty much indistinguishable. All right, so let's wrap all this up. What are the big takeaways? It's simple, really. If you've got a small sample and the population's real standard deviation is a mystery, you reach for the t-distribution. It's the right tool for the job. It cleverly uses the sample's own standard deviation, and its shape is perfectly tuned by those degrees of freedom. And what I think is the coolest part, as your sample gets bigger, it just gracefully morphs back into that familiar z-distribution. And that leaves us with a final, really interesting question to think about. I mean, in the real world, how often do we actually know the true standard deviation of an entire population? Almost never, right? So is the t-distribution just a plan B for small samples? Or is it actually the more honest, more practical workhorse for the messy, incomplete data we all have to deal with every single day?